The heat was a physical thing in the Coyote Bend jail yard. It shimmered in visible waves above the baked adobe dust, distorting the hard lines of the gallows frame in the distance and making the sky a pale, washed-out blue that offered no comfort. It was a hammer of a sun, beating down on the dozen men and the one woman being sorted like freight for the chain gang. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and the metallic tang of despair. Chains clanked with a dull, rhythmic misery, a sound that had become the town's midday heartbeat. Nora Lysander stood among the men, separate not by space but by a force of will that seemed to carve out its own territory in the oppressive air. A fine layer of soot and dust smudged one high cheekbone, a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. Her dress, once the respectable gray wool of a schoolmistress, was torn at the sleeve and stained at the hem. But it was her posture that drew the eye. Her wrists, raw and chafed, were bound in heavy iron, yet her chin was high, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the miserable yard, beyond the mocking silhouette of the distant mesas. She did not flinch. She did not waver. She simply endured, a pillar of defiance in a world designed to grind her down. The charge against her was public disturber, a catch-all for any woman who forgot her place. Nora's crime had been to possess a voice and the audacity to use it. She had walked into the Miners' Rest Saloon 2 nights prior, her steps measured and deliberate, and confronted the men from the Union Pacific line. They called it recruiting, a clean word for a dirty business, signing on young, desperate girls with promises of honest work as cooks and laundresses at the remote railroad camps. Nora, who had taught half of those girls their letters, who knew their dreams and their fears, had called it what it was. She had named the men, their lies, and the fate that awaited any girl who boarded that northbound wagon. For the truth, she was here. Pike Larrabee, the railroad foreman, leaned against the jailhouse wall, his bulk casting a squat, menacing shadow. He hooked his thumbs in a belt that strained to contain his gut and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. He watched Nora with a proprietary amusement. As if her defiance was a personal affront he looked forward to breaking. He nudged Deputy Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of weary resignation. "That one's got fire in her," Larrabee said, his voice a low rumble. He jerked his chin toward Nora. "A little time on the rock pile south of here will sweat that right out of her. Might even teach her to be grateful for a man's attention." His laugh was a harsh, grating sound, like stones being crushed. It wasn't a sound of humor. It was a sound of ownership, of power asserted. It slid through the heat like a knife, and every man in the yard, prisoner and guard alike, felt its edge. Deputy Miller offered a weak, non-committal smile and looked away, his gaze falling on the farrier's shop across the street, on anything other than the woman whose humiliation he was paid to oversee. It was from the deep shade of that farrier's shop that a figure detached itself. The man moved without hurry, his long-legged stride eating up the dusty ground. He was rangy, built of whipcord and leather, with the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full, weighted by things seen and endured. His hat was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the set of a jaw that had known hardship. His hands, as he pushed through the low rope gate into the jail yard, were the hands of a farrier broad, calloused, with scarred knuckles and a strength that came from shaping hot iron. But his posture, the slight slump in his broad shoulders, was that of a man who had lost enough in his life to know the value of what remained. This was Cal Ransom. He didn't look at Pike Larrabee or the deputy. His eyes found Nora and stayed there. There was no pity in his gaze, but there was a flicker of something else, recognition, perhaps, or regret. He had been in town for weeks, had heard the whispers, had seen the wagons, had watched the arrests of vagrants and loudmouths mount. He had done nothing. Cal stopped before the deputy's makeshift desk, a scarred wooden crate set under a sliver of awning. The heat radiated off him. The silence in the yard deepened, broken only by the buzz of flies and the distant clang of a hammer on an anvil. "I'm here about the woman," Cal said. His voice was low, with a rough edge to it. like stones in a dry riverbed. It was a voice that didn't waste words. Deputy Miller blinked, startled out of his stupor. Lysander, she's railroad business. Ransom, Foreman Larrabee's. She's a citizen of this territory, Cal interrupted, his tone even but unyielding. She's entitled to a bond. Larrabee pushed himself off the wall, his amusement curdling into a sneer. You got a stake in this, rancher. She one of your strays. Cal's gaze shifted to Larrabee, slow and deliberate. He looked the foreman up and down, and his silence was more insulting than any curse. He turned back to the deputy. The bond? How much? Miller shifted uncomfortably, sweating. The magistrate set it high for a public disturbance charge. $5. It was an outrageous sum, meant to be impossible. A day's wage for a skilled man was $1, if he was lucky. The law says surety can be posted, Cal stated, not asked. Minimum bond is $1, cash. The rest can be guaranteed. Miller licked his dry lips, his eyes darting toward Larrabee. The foreman gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. But the public setting, the presence of a dozen witnesses, tied the deputy's hands. To deny the letter of the law so openly was a step he wasn't willing to take. $1's the minimum the judge will take, Miller mumbled, defeated. But the surety, it's got to be worth something. Ransom. You got that kind of collateral? Cal didn't answer with words. He reached into his worn vest pocket and pulled out a single, heavy coin. He placed it on the crate. It was a Morgan silver dollar, its eagle worn smooth from years of handling. The sound it made was a solid, definitive thud. Then, he unbuttoned the cuff of his right sleeve and pushed it back, revealing a forearm corded with muscle and tanned dark by the sun. There, burned into his skin just above the wrist, was a simple, clear brand, 2 interlocking circles, like the wings of a sparrow. Sparrow Ridge Ranch, Cal said, his voice barely above a murmur. Yet it carried across the yard. My brand and my word, that's the collateral. It's good for the other $4. It's good for a damn sight more than that, and you know it. A murmur rippled through the prisoners. A man's brand was his soul in this territory. It was his promise, his history, his entire worth. To offer it as collateral for a stranger, for a disgraced schoolmistress, was an act of profound, almost reckless, faith. It was a statement. Deputy Miller stared at the brand, then at Cal's unblinking eyes, and knew he had no choice. He sighed, a long, weary exhalation of breath, and picked up a heavy iron key from the crate. Larrabee's face was a thundercloud. He took a step forward, his hand dropping toward the butt of the pistol on his hip. This ain't your concern. Ransom, he snarled. It is now, Cal said simply, never taking his eyes off the deputy, with a final, resentful glare. Miller walked over to Nora. He fumbled with the lock on her shackles, his movements clumsy. The iron cuffs fell away, clattering into the dust with a sound of shocking finality. They left angry red welts on her wrists, a stark map of her captivity. The town, which had been pretending not to watch, now held its collective breath. Doors stood ajar. Faces peered from behind dusty window panes. This was more than a simple transaction. It was a shift in the delicate, brutal balance of power in Coyote Bend. Nora didn't rub her wrists. She didn't offer a word of thanks. She stood for a moment, letting the blood return to her hands, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of freedom. Then, her eyes began to move. She wasn't looking at Cal Ransom, the man who had just bought her liberty. She was scanning the jail yard with the cool, appraising gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. She studied the exits, the height of the walls, the temperament of the horses tied to the hitching post. She noted the direction of the wind by the way it lifted the dust, mapping the terrain of her new, uncertain reality. She was not a damsel saved. She was a prisoner who had just been transferred to a different kind of custody, and she was already planning her escape. Cal waited patiently, understanding her silence, her calculation. He saw not ingratitude, but survival. Finally, her gaze met his. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a fierce, intelligent light. She took a step closer, so that her words were for him alone, a secret shared in the white-hot glare of the public eye. "You'll regret choosing me," she whispered. The words were not a flirtation, not a promise of trouble in a playful sense. They were a statement of fact, sharp and hard as flint. It was a warning. She was trouble. She carried it with her, courted it, and she would not, could not, put it down, not even for the man who had just struck her chains. A corner of Cal Ransom's mouth lifted. It was not a smile. A smile was too easy, too simple for the moment. This was a more complex expression, an acknowledgement of a hard truth, a flicker of pained understanding. "I already regret waiting this long," he answered, and his voice was heavy with the weight of that truth. He regretted the weeks he had listened to the whispers in the saloon, the days he had watched Pike Larrabee's men grow bolder, the nights he had lain awake, shamed by his own inaction as the fabric of decency was torn apart, girl by girl. His regret wasn't for the choice he had just made, but for all the choices he had failed to make before it. He gave a slight, formal tip of his hat, a gesture of respect that was startling in its sincerity. He turned and unhooked the rope gate, holding it open for her. Together, without another word, they walked out of the jail yard. They moved into the blinding glare of the main street, two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. The murmurs of Coyote Bend followed them, a rising tide of speculation and judgment. But Cal and Nora walked on, their shadows stretching long behind them. Two strangers bound by a silver dollar and a weight of unspoken regrets. Back in the yard, Deputy Miller began gathering his papers, avoiding Pike Larrabee's furious gaze. "Well," the deputy muttered to no one in particular, "a bond's just a clock. Time runs out." Larrabee picked up the Morgan dollar Cal had left on the crate. He turned it over and over in his thick fingers, the silver catching the angry sun. "That's true. Miller," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "But clocks can be smashed." The ride from Coyote Bend to Sparrow Ridge was a silent, suffocating affair, choked by dust and the unspoken things that lay between them. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath. It was a hard country, a place of sharp edges and muted colors. Cal Ransom's spread was nestled exactly as such a land would dictate, not in a gentle valley, but pressed between two rising shoulders of copper-red hills and the gaping maw of a dry wash known as Widow's Run. It was a place that expected little and gave even less. Sparrow Ridge was a testament to thrift and endurance. The main house was small, built of adobe and river stone, its porch shaded by a roof that was more hope than structure. The fences, Nora noted with her teacher's eye for detail, were a patchwork of necessity. Old wire, new wire, salvaged planks, and even lengths of cured yucca rope, all pulled taut in a stubborn line against the emptiness. There was no waste here. The only music was the incessant, high-pitched song of the windmill ribs, spinning frantically in a wind that offered no coolness, only more dust. It sounded less like industry and more like a creature in constant, metallic complaint. Cal pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He swung down, his movements economical, and looped the reins over a hitching post that had been worn smooth by years of use. He gestured to the house, his face still half hidden by the shadow of his hat. "The room on the left is yours," he said, his voice as dry as the air. He retrieved her small, battered satchel from the wagon bed, the one the deputy had grudgingly released, and set it on the porch. Latches on the inside. He didn't wait for a reply. He moved off toward the barn to unhitch the team, his long strides leaving purposeful, solitary tracks in the dust. He was a man who seemed most comfortable with the company of animals and the demands of labor. Nora stood alone on the porch, the silence of the ranch amplifying the ringing in her ears. The latches on the inside. It was the first statement of true freedom she had heard in weeks. She entered the house. It was clean, sparse, and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dry herbs. The room he'd indicated was simple, a narrow iron bed frame with a neatly folded quilt, a small wooden crate upended to serve as a nightstand, and a tin basin and pitcher on a washstand. As promised, a heavy iron latch was bolted firmly to the inside of the door. Later, as the sun began to bleed its fiery colors into the western sky. She saw him return to the house. He didn't come in, but went to a small cook fire he'd built in a ring of stones near the porch. He made coffee in a blackened pot. When it was done, he poured 2 tin cups full. He placed one on the porch rail, then took his own and sat on the bottom step, his back to her door. Nora watched him through the window's wavy glass. He drank his coffee slowly, staring out at the copper hills as they deepened to purple. He never looked back, never gestured for her to join him. The second cup sat on the rail, steam rising from it in a thin, vertical line. An offering without demand. She did not take it. The next morning, it was there again. Before the sun had even crested the hills, she heard the quiet scrape of the pot, the smell of coffee. 2 cups, 1 for him, 1 left on the rail. He went about his chores, mending a harness, checking the windmill's pump. The cup sat there, untouched, until the midday sun had warmed it to the same temperature as the air. On the 3rd morning, the ritual was repeated. This time, after he had moved off toward the corral, Nora slid her door open. The air was still cool, the light clean and sharp. She approached the cup. It was still hot. She picked it up, the tin warm against her palms. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt momentous, like signing a treaty. She was not his prisoner. She was not his debtor. She was present, and she was choosing to drink his coffee. She did not allow this fragile peace to soften her. Safety was a luxury, but purpose was a necessity. Nora Lysander was a woman of ledgers and lists. In her classroom, she had used them to track sums and spelling. In her life, she used them to track injustice. She began to explore. Her mind, trained to observe and categorize, fell back on its old habits. She walked the perimeter of Sparrow Ridge, not as a guest enjoying the air, but as a tactician mapping a new territory. She explored by counting 147 fence posts from the porch to the north boundary line, marked by an outcrop of black basalt, 32 mended sections in that line alone. She counted hoofprints, Cal's 2 mules, his wagon team, the single-shod horse he rode, but near the dry wash, half hidden in the compacted sand, she found others, prints of at least 4, maybe 5 horses, riding together, moving fast. They hadn't come near the house. They had used the cover of Widow's Run. And then she found the wagon groove. It was distinct from the ruts Cal's light ranch wagon made. This groove was deeper, the tracks wider, indicating a heavy freight wagon. It skirted the far edge of Cal's property. Using the shadow of the hills as cover, she knelt, her fingers tracing the packed earth. Something glittered. She picked it out, a fresh, sharp-edged chip of iron, gleaming in the sun. It wasn't the rust-flecked detritus of an old passing. This was new, sheared off a wheel rim or a brake shoe by a sharp rock. This was recent. This was secret. She followed the track with her eyes, her gaze sweeping across the landscape. It didn't lead toward Coyote Bend. It led northeast, a straight, determined line toward Redwater Ford. The last crossing point before the territory opened up into the desolate, unmapped canyons that led to the railroad spurs. This was the road the recruited girls traveled. That night, she sat at the small table in the main room. Cal was outside, his back to the house, sharpening a tool. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was the only sound. By the light of a single kerosene lamp, Nora took out the pencil nub she had kept hidden in the hem of her dress and a sheet of ledger paper salvaged from her satchel. She drew a line down the middle. At the top of the left column, she wrote, "Girls Missing." She listed the names she could remember from her schoolhouse and from the whispers in town: Elspeth Reed, Sarah Gooding, the Marrow sisters, Tessa and Ruth. At the top of the right column, she wrote, "Men Who Profit," her pencil pressed down hard, the graphite dark against the pale paper. She wrote the names as if she were pinning snakes to a board, denying them the right to wriggle free. Pike Larrabee, rail foreman. He was the visible hand, the brute force. Corbett Hale, freight contractors. Their wagon, she was certain, had left the iron chip in the dry wash. They were the transport, the wheels. Simeon Wythe, local magistrate. He was the quiet one, the one who signed the papers, who turned public disturbers like her into chattel and looked the other way as Elspeth and Sarah were processed like freight. He was the authority, the stamp of false legitimacy. A week passed. A strange, silent truce settled over the ranch. Cal spoke little, but his actions were clear. He had stacked fresh firewood by her door. A basin of hot water steamed on the washstand every evening when she returned from her walks. He never mentioned the bond, never asked what she was doing scouring his property lines, never implied she owed him anything. His respect was as vast and as quiet as the landscape itself. They had to go to town for feed and flour. The visit was a calculated risk, but her ledger was empty, and she needed more names, more facts. Coyote Bend felt different. As she sat beside Cal on the wagon bench, she felt the eyes. They weren't just curious. They were hostile, like gnats swarming, invisible but persistent, landing on her face, her hair, the back of her neck. She was marked. She was Cal Ransom's bonded woman, the school marm who had forgotten her place. She kept her chin high. She would not bow. She would not give them the satisfaction of her shame. While Cal negotiated in silence for sacks of feed, his presence a solid, watchful barrier behind her. Nora made her way to the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Dalloway was a small, bird-like woman who had always been kind to her, mending her one good dress for free. Inside, the shop smelled of boat cloth, soap, and chalk. Mrs. Dalloway's hands fluttered to her mouth when she saw Nora. Miss Lysander, they said. Oh, heavens, I am well. Mrs. Dalloway, Nora said, keeping her voice low. I need information, not sympathy. The girls, the ones who signed the camp cook papers. The dressmaker's fear was a tangible thing, making the air in the small shop feel close. She darted a look out the window. Cal was visible, loading the wagon, his movement steady. It's the papers. Miss, she whispered, pulling a scrap of calico from a bin and pretending to measure it. I helped Elspeth Reed pack. She was so proud. Showed me her contract. Clean wages, it said. She paused, her voice dropping further. But the signature. Miss Lysander Elspeth wrote a fine, clear hand. You taught her. But the signature on that paper, it was shaky. Practiced. Practiced, no. Not like she was nervous. Like someone else had practiced writing her name. And Sarah Gooding, her mother, told me the same. The signatures looked alike, like the same hand taught them both to write, and taught them poorly. A cold knot tightened in Nora's stomach. Forgery. It wasn't just coercion, it was outright fraud, legally binding them to a debt they had never even signed. She left the shop and moved with purpose toward the depot, her mind clicking through the implications. A forgery this systematic, this uniform, required a single source, a single educated hand. Near the depot, nailed to the telegraph pole, a scrap of paper flapped in the wind. It was a torn flyer, half ripped away. What remained was printed in bold. Clean type dies work at Larkspur Spur, clean wages and secure lodging. Inquire with the rest was gone. But Nora didn't need the rest. She put her hand on the paper. It was still fresh, the ink dark. She lifted her fingers to her nose. The sharp, acrid smell of lampblack, of industrial ink, clung to them. It was a smell she knew well. It was the exact same ink, the same heavy press stock paper that Magistrate Wythe used for all official courthouse notices. This wasn't a crude sign painted by a foreman. This was an official-looking document, printed on the town's own press. She returned to the wagon, her face a mask. Cal finished tying the last sack and looked at her, his gaze lingering for a half-second. He didn't ask what she had found. He just nodded once and helped her up onto the bench. That evening, the quiet at Sparrow Ridge felt different. It was charged. The sun set, and the coyote chorus began. A wild, lonely sound from the Copper Hills, inside. The lamp cast a single pool of yellow light on the table where Nora had her ledger and the scrap of flyer. Cal sat across from her. Not at the table, but on a low stool by the cold hearth. He wasn't looking at her. He was working. In his hands was a hoof rasp, a long, serrated blade of steel. With a steady, rhythmic motion, he was sharpening it on a whetstone. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. The sound filled the small room, sharp and methodical. It was a tool for an animal's hoof, but in the lamplight, it looked like a blade. He was a quiet man, but he was not a soft one. He had shaped iron with his bare hands. He had branded his own skin. Nora looked from the ledger Simeon Wythe to the flyer courthouse press, to the man sharpening a length of steel in the shadows. He knew she was hunting. He had not offered to help, but he had not stopped her. He had given her a room with a latch, coffee she could choose to drink, and the unspoken, absolute permission to see this through. His silence was not ignorance. It was not neutrality. Nora read it as clearly as she had read the flyer. It was permission. It was an anchor. That night, Nora Lysander lay on the narrow iron bed and listened to the windmill complain to the stars. She heard the faint sounds of Cal bedding down on his cot on the enclosed porch, a deliberate distance he always kept. She reached out and touched the cool iron latch on her door. For the first time in months, she slept without flinching. And when she dreamed, it was not of the jail yard, or the saloon, or the sickening clang of a cell door slamming shut. She dreamed of a wide, open space and the feel of a pencil in her hand, writing a final, definitive line at the bottom of a ledger. The braid of their lives began in silence. Woven from threads of shared morning rituals, the first thread was coffee. Before the sun had struck the high copper ridges, Cal would be up, the scrape of his boots on the packed earth a sound as reliable as the rising of the moon. Nora, awake in her narrow bed, would listen to the clink of the pot, the hiss of the fire catching, and then the rich, dark smell would drift through the thin walls. He would pour 2 cups, his own. He would take to the corral, or the barn, his work already begun. The second cup he would place on the porch rail, just to the left of the door, on a post whose wood grain was worn into a smooth, familiar pattern. For 2 days, the cup sat there. Nora would watch it from her window as the steam faded, as the sun climbed, as the first flies of the afternoon came to investigate. She did not take it. It was a question, and she was not ready to answer. On the 3rd morning, the ritual was the same. The coffee appeared. Cal's shadow moved away toward the windmill, his back to the house. Nora opened her door. The air was cool and clear, holding the promise of the day's coming heat. She stepped onto the porch, her bare feet on the rough wood. She looked at the cup. It was tin, battered, the lip worn. It was full. She picked it up. The metal was hot, a solid, living warmth against her palms, which were still healing from the irons. She brought it to her lips and drank. The coffee was black, bitter, and scalding hot. It tasted like survival, from the far side of the yard. Cal paused in his work, his hand on the windmill's ladder. He did not turn, but she saw his shoulders, which had been tensed, settle. He resumed his climb. The question had been answered. That afternoon, she found the ranch ledger on a shelf by the hearth. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover warped by damp and heat. Cal's entries were sparse, functional, written in a rough, slashing hand that was hard to decipher. Numbers were scrawled, inventories guessed at. It was the book of a man who worked with his hands, not with a pen. She took the book and a bottle of ink he kept for marking feed sacks, along with her own sharp pencil nub. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where her own ledger of vengeance was growing, and she began to repair his. She started a new page, drawing clean columns with the edge of a ruler. Her penmanship, the one thing the jail yard hadn't been able to stain, flowed across the page, elegant and precise. Salt, nails, sorghum, barbed wire. Tallying the mundane realities of his life steadied her. Her world had been one of ideas, of words and figures meant to elevate. His was one of things, of tools and commodities meant to endure. In rectifying his accounts, she felt her own hands steady, her own mind clear. She was anchoring herself to this place, line by line. A few days later, Cal returned from a long ride, not from town, but from the high country. He dismounted. his face coated in fine red dust. He didn't come to the porch immediately, but went to his saddlebags. Nora watched him from the window, where she was ostensibly mending a grain sack. He took something from the bag and walked to the porch. He didn't knock. He simply set the object on the top step and walked away to tend to his horse. Nora waited a full minute before opening the door. On the step sat a battered tin canteen. It was old, dented from countless rides, but it was clean. He had replaced the old, cracked cork stopper with a new, tightly fitted one, and tucked into the leather strap that held the canteen was a single, fresh sprig of blue larkspur. She picked it up. The flower was a vivid, shocking blue against the rust-colored dust of the porch. It was a wild thing, not a cultivated rose. It was a piece of the high country, a piece of the silence he carried with him. There was no note, no request. It was a statement. You walk the perimeters. You will need water. This is for you. The flower was something else entirely. A gesture so quiet and so unexpected it pierced the armor she'd so carefully constructed. She took the canteen inside, but left the flower on the table, its color a bright point of defiance in the dim room. Nora knew her investigation, the one she filed away in her mind every night, would require her to be mobile. She could not be bound to the ranch. She had to be able to ride, and ride well. Cal had a spare mare, a dun-colored animal with a watchful eye named Jenny. She was not vicious, but she was opinionated. Nora, whose experience with horses was limited to a placid buggy pony from her old life, approached the mare with a textbook understanding and a stomach full of nerves. Her first attempt to mount was a failure. Her skirts tangled. Her knees, still weak from her ordeal, trembled so badly she couldn't find the stirrup. The mare, sensing her hesitation, sidestepped neatly, leaving Nora grasping at air, her face burning with humiliation. She was back in the jail yard, weak and exposed, Pike Larrabee's laugh echoing in her ears. She gritted her teeth, grabbed a handful of mane, and hauled herself up. It was clumsy, graceless. She landed too hard, and the mare bolted 10 feet before Nora, clinging like a burr, managed to haul back on the reins, her knuckles white. "Easy," she hissed, as much to herself as to the horse. She rode anyway, every day. After her work on the ledger was done, she would saddle the mare. She rode out past the fences, toward the wash, refusing the ghost of her own humiliation. Her knees still trembled, but they did so in the saddle. She was refusing to be helpless. From the barn doorway, Cal would watch, his face unreadable. He never offered help, never criticized her awkwardness. He simply left the saddle oiled and the gate to the corral open, granting her the dignity of her own struggle. The shift came, as it often does, not with a word, but with a crisis. A stray heifer, bony and wild-eyed, had broken through a weak spot in the fence near the windmill and gotten herself jammed in a gap between 2 thick mesquite bushes. She was thoroughly stuck, bawling in terror, threatening to break a leg. Cal had been trying to rope her, to pull her back, but the angle was wrong. He was sweating, cursing under his breath, his patience worn thin. Nora, drawn by the noise, stood for a moment, taking in the geometry of the problem. Brute force was failing. She looked at the trapped animal, then at the towering windmill spar just yards away. "The rope is wrong," she said, her voice cutting through the animal's cries. Cal stopped pulling, breathing hard. "You got a better idea, schoolmistress?" It wasn't mean, just exhausted. "Yes," she said, "leverage." Before he could argue, she ran to the lean-to, grabbing a length of heavy pulley rope she had seen coiled there. She scrambled up the base of the windmill, her skirts catching. She threw the rope over a low-lying spar, creating a simple, strong pulley. She tossed one end down to him. "Put that end around her chest, not her neck," she commanded. "I'll take the other." He stared at her for a second, then did as she said, cinching the rope low around the heifer's ribs. Nora took the pulling end, wrapped it around the solid hitching post, and simply leaned back, using her weight and the pulley's mechanical advantage. "Now," she said, "nudge her from behind, gently." Cal pushed the heifer's rump, The animal, pulled from above and pushed from behind, scrambled free of the gap, landing on its knees in the dust. It stood, shook itself, and trotted away, indignant but unharmed. Cal stood by the empty gap, breathing hard. He looked at the rope on the windmill, then at Nora. He slowly recoiled the rope he'd been using. His surprise was small, contained, but it was absolutely real. He had seen her as a victim, then as a guest, then as a meticulous bookkeeper. He had not, until that moment, seen her as an equal partner in the harsh algebra of the ranch. That night, the atmosphere in the small house was different. The silence was easier, the space between them smaller. He sat at the table, running a thumb over the new, clean lines of his ledger. He motioned her over. "You'll be riding farther," he said. It wasn't a question. "You need this." He took a short length of rope. His hands, broad and scarred, moved with a speed and grace that was almost hypnotic. He showed her the quick tie. One-handed knot a rider could tie in the reins while his other hand was occupied. "Watch again," he said. His hand slowed. Loop, twist, pull. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he guided her hand through the motion. The touch was impersonal, functional, and yet it sent a jolt through her skin. She fumbled. "Again," he said, "patient." She practiced until her fingers, more used to a pencil, learned the new language. Loop, twist, pull. She got it. A small nod of approval from him was her reward. She, in turn, pointed to the ledger. "You're not as good," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Your numerals are not—" She took the pencil. "A 5, she said, "needs a straight back. A 3 should be open. Like this." She guided his hand, his large, rough fingers looking clumsy and oversized, holding the small pencil. He concentrated, his brow furrowed. He wrote a line of 5s, each one better than the last. When he finally drew one that was perfect, a low sound rumbled in his chest. It was a laugh, quiet and under his breath, rusty from disuse. It was a sound of earned warmth, a truce declared in the shared light of the lantern. The night settled into this new rhythm. The single lantern on the kitchen table, 2 shadows on the wall, distinct but coexisting. Nora would pore over her papers, her mind filing away the new facts she was gathering. She was mapping the enemy's habits. She knew from a stable boy that the courthouse clerks took their supper at precisely 6, leaving the offices empty for at least an hour. She knew from a gossip at the Mercantile that the depot telegrapher, a man named Silas, stepped out for a smoke and a cough every night at 9, regular as a clock. And she knew, from her own rides on the dun mare, that Pike Larrabee or his men made a patrol, not every night, but every other dusk, riding the line of Widow's Run, checking the silent, hidden freight road. Her columns were filling with data, her plans slowly taking shape. This information was dangerous. It was her only weapon, and she remembered all too well the feeling of her wrists in iron, of being searched and humiliated. She took her mending basket, but instead of the grain sack, she took one of her own heavy wool skirts, with precise, tiny stitches. She sewed a flat, hidden pocket into the inside lining, just below the waistband, a place where folded paper would lie flat, invisible. She would not be unarmed again. Across the table, in the same pool of light, Cal had his own ritual. He would take down his Winchester from the pegs above the door. It was a beautiful, terrible thing of oiled walnut and blue-black steel. He would spread a cloth and methodically clean it, his hands moving with the same practiced, economical grace with which he tied the knot. The smell of gun oil and solvent would fill the room. The rifle was always within reach. When he was on the porch, it leaned against the wall beside him. When he was in the barn, it was on a peg by the door. It was as much a part of him as his hat or his scarred hands. Nora, her needle pulling the thread taut, would watch him. She saw the vigilance in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes would flick to the dark windows. This was a man who was waiting for something. This was a man with a past that had not yet released him. She refused to ask. The question felt like a trespass, a violation of the fragile, unspoken boundaries they had built. Their small domesticity was built on the foundation of what was not said. He had his ghosts. She had hers. And Cal, feeling her gaze on him, would continue to slide the oiled rag down the long barrel, his face a mask in the lamplight. He refused to say why the gun was always there. Not yet. The silence between them held its ground, a shared territory of respect, a quiet that did not bruise. Errand day was a necessity, not a choice. The ranch required supplies, and supplies were in Coyote Bend. As the wagon wheels slowed, grinding into the thick dust of the main street, Nora felt the air change. It was no longer the quiet, breathable air of Sparrow Ridge. It was thick, charged, and hostile. The town was louder than she remembered. A newsboy on the corner, his face smudged with the very ink she'd come to hunt, was barking at the top of his lungs. Order and industry. Read all about it. Mayor proclaims new rail spur to bring prosperity. Order and industry comes to Coyote Bend. His voice was a shrill counterpoint to the low, humming judgment of the town itself. As she and Cal stepped down from the wagon, the sound of the street seemed to dim, replaced by a more intimate, more piercing collection of noises. The flick of eyes from behind curtained windows, the sudden silence as they passed the farrier's shop, the distinct, wet click of tongues from the two old women rocking on the hotel porch. Nora Lysander was a public spectacle. She was the fallen woman, the bonded woman, the property of the quiet rancher who had paid $1 for her. She felt the stares like a physical weight, a shroud of shame they were attempting to lay over her shoulders. She kept her chin high, her gaze fixed on the broad, planked doorway of the Mercantile. They had to pass the Miners' Rest Saloon to get there. The batwing doors exhaled a blast of hot air, sour with the smell of spilled beer and unwashed men. A group of them loitered on the porch, their morning already lost to whiskey and cards. One of them, a gambler in a stained silk vest, his eyes puffy and sharp, detached himself from the shadows. He let his gaze travel over Nora, a slow, appraising inventory that started at her boots, climbed the line of her mended wool skirt, and lingered on her face and form. It was the look a man gave a horse he was considering buying, a look that stripped her of personhood, reducing her to stock. Nora tensed, her hand clenching into a fist at her side. Before the man could take a single step, Cal moved. It was not a lunge, not an aggressive act. He simply shifted his position, stepping from her right side to her left, placing his body squarely between her and the gambler. He became a door that would not open, a wall of quiet, solid presence. He did not look at the man. He just kept walking, his movement forcing Nora to walk with him, shielded by his shoulder. The gambler, his audience of saloon loafers watching, couldn't let it go. His voice, slick with malice, smeared the air. "That's a mighty fine-looking piece you picked up. Ransom," he called out. Cal did not break stride. The gambler's voice grew louder, laced with a sneer. "What'd she cost you?" Cal's first answer was a turned shoulder, a silent, contemptuous dismissal. He guided Nora past the saloon, his hand lightly on her elbow. His message clear: this is beneath us. But the humiliation was a hook, and the gambler wanted to see his catch struggle. "I asked you a question. Rancher, or did you pay so much you're ashamed to say?" Cal stopped. He didn't turn fully, just angled his head, his face still in the shadow of his hat brim. The street noise seemed to fall away. The newsboy's cries, the hammer of the blacksmith, all of it went silent. "Words can come back with spurs on," Cal said. His voice was not loud. It was soft iron, a low, level warning that promised consequence, not heat. It was the sound of a gate latch clicking shut, a sound of finality. The gambler's smile faltered. He held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes were hard. Cal turned away, his point made, and guided Nora toward the Mercantile. "I need to see Mrs. Dalloway," Nora said, her voice tight. The encounter had left her trembling with a cold, precise rage. "I'll meet you at the Mercantile," Cal said, his gaze sweeping the street. He understood. He did not question her, did not offer to go with her. He granted her the autonomy she needed. She slipped into the dressmaker's shop, the small bell above the door announcing her with a cheerful, inappropriate jingle. The shop smelled of chalk, bolt cloth, and the faint, clean scent of soap, Mrs. Dalloway was pinning a hem, her mouth full of pins. When she saw Nora, her eyes went wide, and she quickly shut the door behind her. "Miss Lysander," she whispered, pulling the pins from her mouth. "It's not safe for you to be seen here. I'm not here to be safe. Mrs. Dalloway, I'm here for information. The contracts, the signatures you saw." The small, bird-like woman's hands fluttered. She went to a spool of thread, her back to the window. "He's got them all. Miss the magistrate, he keeps the contracts. And the press." She fumbled in her sewing basket, her fingers clumsy with fear. I was sweeping out the print room. Old Mr. Hemlock, the printer. He lets me take the scraps for patterns. I found this." She pressed a tiny, folded packet into Nora's hand. It was not just a packet. It was a needle, wrapped in a loop of dark thread, and folded inside that was a small scrap of heavy, official paper. It wasn't a document, just a test strip, the kind a printer would use to check his ink. But on it, embossed in dark ink, was a seal, a stylized eagle, and beneath it, 3 initials, S.W. Simeon Wythe. Nora breathed. "It's the official courthouse seal." "Mrs." Dalloway whispered, her eyes terrified. "He uses it on everything. The land grants, the rail contracts, and, God help us, the girls' work papers. He stamps them all himself." Nora closed her hand around the scrap. This was the proof, the tangible link between the courthouse, the printer, and the contracts. The needle and thread were a cover, a clever excuse had she been stopped and searched. "Thank you, Ilara," Nora said, using the woman's first name, a quiet acknowledgement of the risk she was taking. "Be careful, Miss Lysander. That man, he's not just a judge. He's a spider." Nora nodded, slipping the small, vital packet into her pocket. She left the shop and walked into the harsh sunlight. Her purpose hardened. She met Cal at the mercantile. The clerk, a young man named Hatcher with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, was bagging flour for another customer. When he saw Nora, his hands stilled. He finished with the other customer, took the money, and then, deliberately, turned to wipe down a counter that was already clean. Nora stepped forward. "A sack of flour, please, and 20 pounds of salt." Hatcher did not look at her. He continued to wipe the counter. "Be with you in a minute." Cal, who had been standing by the door, took 2 silent steps forward. His shadow fell across the counter, eclipsing the light from the window. Hatcher froze. Cal's voice was as quiet as it had been in the street. "Soft iron. She gave you her order." Hatcher licked his lips, his gaze darting to the street, as if looking for Pike Larrabee or the deputy. I'm busy. Mr. Ransom, busy or not," Cal said, his voice dropping another level. "The question is, you sell to citizens, or not?" The word hung in the air. Citizens. It was a challenge. It was a redefinition of her status, a public declaration. He had not called her his ward, or his responsibility. He had called her a citizen. Hatcher paled. To refuse service to a citizen was a different matter, one that could bring trouble he didn't want. "Yes, sir, of course." He turned, his movements suddenly jerky and fast, and began to fill her order. As he weighed the salt, Nora's gaze drifted to the other customers. In the back, near the bolts of calico, a young woman in a faded, rust-colored shawl was pretending to inspect a spool of ribbon, but Nora felt her stare. She turned, and their eyes met. The girl was young, perhaps 17. Her face was thin, her eyes wide and haunted. It was Tessa Marrow, one of the sisters Nora had listed in her ledger. Tessa, her sister, Ruth, was one of the missing. The moment of contact was electric, a shock of recognition, of shared knowledge, passed between them. Nora saw stark, bottomless terror in the girl's eyes. Tessa Marrow knew. She knew what was happening, and then, as quickly as it had come, the connection broke. Tessa tore her gaze away, her face flushing with panic. She dropped the ribbon and hurried out the side door. her shawl pulled tight, a small, frightened animal bolting for cover. Shy or scared? Nora knew the answer. It was pure, unadulterated fear. They paid for their goods. Cal's silver dollar landing on the counter with the same finality as the one he had placed on the deputy's crate. They loaded the wagon in silence. "One more stop," Nora said, her voice firm. She walked to the mayor's notice board outside the telegraph office. It was covered in papers. Land auctions, wanted posters, railroad timetables, and there, tacked in the center, was a sheaf of new contracts. The bold type was familiar laborers and camp cooks wanted, larkspur spur, good wages. She didn't read the text. She looked at the bottom, at the line for the magistrate's approval, and she saw it. The signature of Simeon Wythe. It was not a simple, functional signature. It was a statement of ego, full of elaborate, sweeping curves, a calligraphy flourish on the tail of the E. She traced it with her finger, the dust on the paper gritty beneath her skin. She knew that flourish. She had seen it before, written in a smaller, tighter hand. It was the same flourish she had tried to drill out of him, the same self-important loop. He had been a student in her classroom, years ago, a boy of 15, already arrogant, already convinced of his own superiority. Simeon Wythe, her former student. A new, colder layer of understanding settled over her. He wasn't just a corrupt official. This was personal. He was undoing her work, taking the very girls she had taught to read and write and turning them into slaves, signing their names with the same arrogant flick of the wrist she had tried to correct. "Heard you was a schoolmarm." The gambler's voice, louder this time, broke her concentration. He had followed them. He was standing 10 feet away, his thumbs hooked in his vest, a fresh wave of whiskey-fueled confidence radiating from him. "Seems Ransom here bought himself a teacher." The gambler sneered, playing to the gathering crowd. "What's the lesson today? How to spend his money?" Nora did not move, her fingers still resting on Wythe's signature. Cal stepped up beside her. He didn't look at the gambler. He didn't reach for the gun on his hip. He simply stood, a silent, unmovable object. But Nora, standing so close, could see the tiny, methodical movements of his eyes. He wasn't looking at the gambler. He was counting. He counted the 3 men who stood with the gambler. He measured the distance to the porch beam over the gambler's head, assessing its height and stability. His gaze flicked to the hitching rail, a potential weapon or obstacle. He noted the position of the sun, where it would blind. He cataloged the men in the crowd who looked like they might join a fight, and the ones who would run. And then, his inventory complete. He turned his head and looked at the gambler. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of pure, cold calculation. A look that said, "I have weighed this moment, and you are not worth the trouble you will cause." It was the look of a man who had seen real violence and found this cheap imitation wanting. He did not say a word. The gambler, who had puffed himself up for a brawl, suddenly deflated. He saw no fear, no anger he could feed. He saw only a quiet, absolute certainty that this was not a fight he could win, not in any way that mattered. He spat in the dust, a last, pathetic gesture of defiance. "Ah, hell," he muttered. "He ain't worth the time." He turned, his loafers shuffling, and disappeared back into the saloon. From a shaded doorway across the street, a man watched. He was not the deputy. This man was older, his face a map of sun-baked wrinkles, a tarnished star pinned to his vest. He was a marshal, or perhaps a ranger, just passing through. He had watched the entire exchange, his hand resting on his hip, impassive. As Cal turned from the gambler, the lawman's gaze met his. The lawman tipped 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, a small, knowing gesture. It was a greeting not between friends, but between 2 men who were old, familiar neighbors with danger. The lawman understood, and approved of, the economy of Cal's actions. Cal nodded once, a curt acknowledgement, and helped Nora onto the wagon. As he moved to the driver's side, a small boy darted from the alley between the telegraph office and the mercantile. He was no older than 12, his face streaked with dirt and printer's ink. He ran past Nora, pretending to stumble, and shoved a wadded piece of paper into her hand. "Sorry, ma'am," he yelped, and was gone before she could even react. She looked down. His left thumb, which had pressed the paper into her palm, had left a perfect black smudge of ink. The printer's boy. She waited until the wagon was clear of the town, the sound of the newsboy fading behind them. Then, shielded by the wagon's side, she unrolled the paper. It was a telegram stub, a discarded scrap from the telegrapher's floor. The message was brief, a series of clipped phrases. "Larkspur spur payroll delayed stop. Send replacements urgently stop. Wythe confirms 12, end." Nora read it twice. Replacements. Not new hires. Not cooks. Replacements. Like parts of a machine. Like ammunition. Like livestock. Her hand closed around the paper, crinkling it into a tight ball. The key wasn't just the message. It was the network. The printer's boy. The dressmaker. The frightened girl in the rust-colored shawl. The town was not just a solid wall of hostility. It was full of cracks. And in those cracks, allies were hiding, waiting for a lever. She looked at Cal. He was driving the team, his eyes on the horizon, his jaw set. He had called her a citizen. He had faced down a bully for her, not with his fists, but with his will. She slipped the telegram stub and the printer's seal into the hidden pocket of her skirt. She was armed now, armed with proof, and with the first fragile threads of a web that could pull the whole rotten structure down. The world changed in an instant. The copper sky, which had been pressing down with a dry, suffocating heat, was suddenly ripped open. The change began not with a drop, but with a sound, a hollow moan from the west that rushed through Widow's Run, silencing the windmill's complaint. Then the first gust hit the ranch, slamming into the adobe house like a physical blow, rattling the windows in their frames. A wall of gray obliterated the horizon. It wasn't just rain, it was a vertical river, a desert deluge that turned the air to water. The baked dust of the yard, which had not seen moisture in months, exploded in a chaotic mist, and the smell of ozone and wet earth, sharp and clean, filled the air. Sparrow Ridge, once an exposed speck in a vast, dry wilderness, became a small, isolated world, enclosed by silver curtains of falling water. The drumming on the roof was a deafening, relentless tattoo, the sound of 1,000 horses galloping across the shingles. Nora, standing at the window, watched the transformation. The world she had been mapping was gone, erased. Cal was already moving. Power found its purpose. He was a man of the earth, and the earth was in revolt. He burst from the barn, his hat pulled low, his duster already dark with water. He fought his way through the wind to the corral, his movements economical and certain. She watched him force the stubborn mules into the lean-to, his shoulder pressed against a recalcitrant flank. He wrestled the gate shut, the wind tearing at him, then made a run for the spare mare, Jenny, who was rearing in terror by the fence. He spoke to her, his voice lost in the roar, but his hands, gentle and firm on her neck, calmed her enough to lead her to safety. He was the master of this small, besieged domain. He moved through the chaos with a quiet, powerful competence. When the stock was secure, he stood for a moment in the center of the yard, the rain plastering his shirt to his back, and scanned the fence lines, as if daring the storm to do its worst. Then he came toward the house. He moved through the deluge, a man carved from wet stone. Nora stepped back from the window, her heart hammering in time with the rain. She heard his heavy, sodden boots on the porch. He didn't knock. He wouldn't. The latch was on her side. She heard a scrape, a pause. Then his footsteps retreated, moving toward his own cot on the exposed end of the porch. She waited a beat, then opened her door. Hanging from the peg beside her door was a thick gray wool blanket. It was dry. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. He had retrieved it from his own chest, an offering of warmth, and had walked away. soaked to the skin, without asking for shelter for himself. He was at the far end of the porch, wringing the water from his hat, the wind driving sheets of rain onto his back. "Mr. Ransom," she called out. Her voice was thin against the storm's roar. He stopped, his hand on the brim of his hat, and turned. He was a silhouette against the wall of water. "That porch will be a river in an hour," she said, louder. "The fire is lit in the kitchen. Come inside." He stood motionless for a long second, weighing the invitation. This was a new boundary. She was not just accepting his coffee. She was inviting him into the shared warmth of the hearth, into the small, dry space she now considered her own. He nodded once, a sharp, quick movement, and crossed the porch, bringing the storm in with him. He dripped on the stone floor, his hat held in his hands. The kitchen, lit by a single kerosene lamp and the bright, flickering dance of the fire, felt impossibly warm, impossibly safe. The drumming of the rain on the roof was their insulation, cutting them off from Coyote Bend, from Pike Larrabee, from the entire world. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of the two chairs by the hearth. She made coffee, her hands steady. The simple, domestic act was a shield against the violence of the world outside. She handed him a mug, and he took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The steam rose from the two cups, fogging the small window pane, blurring the line between the silver rain and the dark land. They sat. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic roar of the storm. It was a silence that demanded to be filled. "You've seen a storm like this before," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Once," he said, his voice low, seeming to resonate with the thunder that rumbled in the distance. "In the Panhandle, we lost 20 head. It's the wind, more than the water." "You handled the stock well, Jenny." "She's got more sense than most men I know," he said, a ghost of his smile touching his lips. He looked into his coffee cup. The conversation, like a careful bridge, began to build, plank by plank, across the space between them. "I had a sister," Nora said suddenly, her voice quiet. The confession surprised her, pulled from her by the storm's intimacy. "Adeline, she was younger than me." Cal looked at her, his gaze steady, inviting the truth. "I was the smart one. I got to be the schoolmistress. She was the pretty one, and she was trusting. I tried to warn her about a man, a smooth talker from back east. He promised her a life in St. Louis. I told her he was lying." Nora's knuckles were white on her cup. "She said I was jealous. She went with him. He left her in a hotel in Kansas City. She tried to make her way. I got a letter. 6 months later, she was gone. Sickness, the kind that comes from a hard life." She looked at the fire, her eyes seeing a different city, a different loss. "When I saw Pike Larrabee talking to Tessa Marrow, when I saw him promising clean wages, all I could see was Adeline. All I could see was that man's smile. I couldn't protect my sister, Mr. Ransom. I couldn't stop her, but I will be damned if I let him do it to another." The kitchen was silent, the fire popping, the rain a steady, hushing sound. Cal set his mug down on the hearth. "My brother's name was Eli," he said, his voice rough. He had never spoken this name to her. He wasn't strong, not like me. I was the farrier. I had the forge. He was slighter. He wanted to make his own way. Took a job with the railroad, laying track up north. The winter of '82 was hard. Snows came early. He picked up a small twig from the wood basket and fed it to the fire, watching it catch. The foreman, a man just like Larrabee, cut from the same rotten timber, cut their wages. Said the snow was delaying the line, and the men would bear the cost. Then he cut the rations. Eli, he caught a fever, a lung fever. They left him in a tent, no medicine, not enough food. He was disposable. Cal's hand, resting on his knee, clenched into a fist. "I got there a week too late. He was already buried, in a ditch. I was shoeing horses for the man who cut the rations, and my brother was dying a mile away. I didn't know." He snapped the twig in his hand. "When I saw you in that jail yard, when I heard Larrabee laugh, I saw Eli. I saw a man who thought people were just tools to be used and broken." He had bought her bond not as an act of charity, but as an act of delayed, furious justice for his brother. Their two separate, silent wars were the same war. The thunder, which had been a constant cannonade, softened. The drumming on the roof eased into a steady, rhythmic pulse, a gentle shushing. The storm had passed its peak, leaving in its wake a new, profound quiet. As the world outside softened, so did the space between them. The confessions hung in the warm air, leaving them both exposed, their armor of quiet and purpose stripped away. Nora stood, taking his empty mug, the smallness of the room, the shared warmth. The stories told it all conspired to shrink the distance. She turned from the wash basin and found him standing. Too, he was close enough for her to see the flicker of the firelight in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She looked up at him, her gaze searching his, as if for a truth that had been dropped and lost. She saw the man who had lost his brother, the man who had gently calmed a frightened horse, the man who had left a blanket by her door and expected nothing. This time, she made the choice. She lifted her hand, the one that had held the pencil, the one that had learned his one-handed knot. She laid 2 fingers against his jaw. His skin was rough with a day's growth of beard, damp and warm. He didn't move. He didn't lean in. He didn't pull away. He didn't breathe. His stillness was a question, an answer, and a permission all in one. It was the most profound respect he could have shown her. He was giving her the power, the same power as the latch on her door. She could leave, or she could stay. The choice lived entirely with her. She stayed. She rose on her toes, a small, definite movement. He met her, his head dipping. Their first kiss was not a collision. It was a discovery. It was unhurried, hesitant. A question asked and answered in the same moment. It tasted of coffee and rain and the clean, metallic tang of the storm. His lips were softer than she could have imagined. It was a kiss of patience, a mouth learning the shape of another. When they parted, it was only by an inch. His large, calloused hands, hands that could shape iron and tame horses, came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones with impossible gentleness. Her own hands, which had been at her sides, found their way to his shoulders, gripping the solid muscle beneath the damp wool of his shirt. They were mapping safe places. His shoulder, her cheek, the strong line of his throat. Her hands slid around his back, pressing against the small of it, feeling the strength and warmth of him through the fabric. They breathed, their foreheads touching. The shared air was as intimate as the kiss. A small, shaky smile touched Nora's lips, a smile of disbelief and relief. He returned it, his own rare smile, the one that was more truth than anything else, crinkling the corners of his eyes. The room held them. The firelight and the soft, hushing rain cupped them in a bubble of perfect, fragile safety. Another kiss, this one deeper, warmer, a slow burn of awakening. This was not the desperate, hurried coupling of the world they fought against. This was the opposite. This was slow. This was chosen. He drew back, his eyes dark, his breath unsteady. He held her gaze, and in his look, she saw the unspoken question, the respect that held him back. Nora answered without words. She took his hand, the one that bore the Sparrow Ridge brand, and laced her fingers with his. It was a perfect fit, her smoother skin against his calluses. She held his gaze, her own clear and steady, and she nodded. It was a clear, steady yes. Nothing rushed. Everything felt. He led her to her room, the one with the latch, the narrow iron bed, her sanctuary, waited in the shadows. They sat on the edge, the sound of the rain a soft drum. The light from the kitchen fire cast a warm, golden glow through the doorway, painting them in shadow. There was no hurry. Clothes loosened. His fingers, large and seemingly clumsy, were impossibly gentle as he unpinned her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders. Her own hands, trembling slightly, worked the buttons of his damp shirt, revealing the hard-packed muscle of his chest. Skin warmed. He reached for the wool blanket he had left for her, the one from the porch, and pulled it over them as they lay down. The camera of the mind. The watcher in the room stayed high, respectful. It did not see details. It saw the press of bodies seeking warmth, a shelter from the storm. It saw faces, his rough cheek against hers. It heard the sound of breath, soft and synchronizing. It heard the whispered, simple yeses, confirmations of comfort, of presence, of consent. This was not a taking. It was a sharing, a silent, tender agreement to be vulnerable together, under the blanket, under the sound of the rain. Later, long after the fire had burned down to embers and the storm had become a distant, rumbling memory, they lay angled toward each other. The pre-dawn light was a thin, gray watercolor wash at the window. They were tangled in the wool blanket, her head on his shoulder, his arm securely around her waist. Her fingers idly traced the lines on his palm, the map of calluses and scars from the forge and the fence wire. "This one," she whispered, "is from the forge." He nodded, his lips brushing her hair. His own hand found the small, pale scar on her collarbone. "Comet scar," he murmured. "I fell from an oak tree when I was 7. I was trying to read a book and watch a nest of hawks at the same time." He smiled against her hair. They lay in that comfortable, shared silence for a long time. But the intimacy of the night demanded a new clarity, an erasure of the old debts. "Cal," she said, her voice soft but firm against his chest, "I don't owe you for this." She had to say it. She was not the $1 bond. She was not the woman from the jail yard. This night was not a transaction. He didn't pause. He didn't misunderstand. He pulled her closer, his arm tightening around her, a solid, protective weight. "No," he answered, his voice a low, sure rumble. "You owe no one for being loved, Nora." Dawn found them in the kitchen. The world outside was scoured clean, the air new and sharp. The smell of coffee was the first promise of the day, but this morning, the porch rail was empty. 2 tin cups steamed on the kitchen table, side by side. Both were warmed by lips that had chosen. The intimacy of the storm-washed dawn was a fragile thing, a bubble of warmth and shared breath. It lasted until the sun was high, and it was broken by the sharp, determined sound of a single horse ridden hard into the yard. Both Cal and Nora were outside, mending the section of fence the stray heifer had broken, the work between them easy and rhythmic. Cal looked up first, his body tensing, his hand dropping to rest on the hammer in his belt. It was Tessa Marrow. She was not the frightened girl from the mercantile. She rode in on a tired-looking mule, sitting astride, not side saddle. The rust-colored shawl was gone, replaced by a man's canvas jacket, patched at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her jaw was set with a resolve that made her look years older than her 17 years. She pulled the mule to a halt, her eyes fixed on Nora, bypassing Cal as if he were just another fence post. "I saw you," Tessa said, her voice rough, breathless from the ride. "In town. You're the one they put in irons. You're the one who isn't afraid." "Tessa," Nora said, stepping forward, her hands open. "Your sister, Ruth, is why I'm here," the girl cut in, swinging her leg over the mule and sliding to the ground. She was all sharp angles and burning, furious energy. She stalked past Nora, onto the porch, and into the kitchen as if she owned it. She slapped a thin, canvas-bound book onto the table. "I poured coffee for the spur men. At the Depot Hotel, they talk. They're stupid. They think because I'm a girl, I'm deaf." Nora and Cal followed her in. The kitchen, which had been their sanctuary, was now a war room. Tessa tapped the book. "This is Pike Larrabee's. He left it in the dining room when he went to the telegraph office. I took it." Nora's hand went to the book. It wasn't a personal ledger. It was a receipt book, the kind a freight company would use. She opened it. The pages were thin, with carbon duplicates. The first few pages were intact receipts for hay, for axle grease, for whiskey. Then she got to the back section. Here, dozens of the thin duplicate pages had been torn out. Only the thick original sheets remained. They were not receipts for goods. They were contracts. Advances. They were titled, "Look," Tessa said, her finger jabbing the page. "That's Elspeth Reed's name, and that's my sister's." Nora looked. The signatures were shaky. Just as Mrs. Dalloway had described, the same practiced, forged hand. And in the bottom corner of every single contract was a hard, embossed stamp, pressed into the paper. It was the same seal she had in her pocket, the eagle, and the initials S.W. "Simeon Wythe," Nora whispered. "The name tasting like ash. He stamps them," Tessa said, her voice vibrating with hatred. "They get the girls to sign, or they sign for them. And then the debt starts." Nora flipped through the pages, her mind, trained in arithmetic and logic, seizing the pattern. The revelations unspooled, cold and sharp. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. "It's not one debt," Nora said, half to herself, half to Cal. "It's a ladder. First, they charge a travel advance. $20. An impossible sum. They work that off. They think. But then there's a security hold for their lodging, which is a shack they share with 10 other girls, and a breach fee," Tessa added, her voice bitter. Sarah Gooding tried to walk away. They caught her. Larrabee told her she had breached her contract. The fee was $50. He told her there was another way she could work it off, a way that paid faster. Cal, who had been standing by the hearth, his face a mask of stone, finally spoke. His voice was a low growl. "A debt that never ends. They're not just taking girls, they're making property." He looked at Nora, and a new, colder understanding passed between them. The full scope of it was laid bare. This was not just Pike Larrabee's crude operation. This was a sophisticated business model, designed and endorsed by the local magistrate. "Simeon Wythe, the railroad," Cal said, his gaze distant. "It's not just the men. It's the freight." Nora looked up. "What do you mean, the night train?" "I've heard it. Twice in the last month. Comes through after midnight. No whistle. That's illegal. The depot is supposed to be closed. Nothing logged. Larrabee and his men. They meet it. I thought it was just whiskey. Maybe guns. But what if it's bigger?" He looked at the receipt book. What if Wythe isn't just stamping contracts? What if he's stamping manifests for freight that doesn't exist? To cover for freight that does, a night train, unlogged freight, girls delivered under illegal contracts. It was all one snake. "If they're running illegal freight," Nora said, her mind racing, "the real manifests won't be in a receipt book Larrabee leaves in a cafe. They'll be locked up, with the real ledgers, the ones that show the money." "Where Tessa demanded?" Nora turned from the table and went to a small shelf where Cal kept maps of the territory, for tracking water and cattle. She unrolled one across the kitchen table. On top of the ledger, she picked up her pencil. The energy in the room shifted. This was no longer just an investigation. It was the preparation for a heist. "The power isn't with Larrabee," Nora said, her voice sharp with moral clarity. "He's just the muscle. The power is with Wythe. The power is in the paper. We need the real ledger, the one he keeps." She tapped the map. "There are 3 points. 1, the courthouse press." She circled Coyote Bend, where the flyers and contracts are printed, where Wythe has his office, where the safe must be. She moved the pencil. 2 Bishop Spur, a small line shack. Larrabee's men use it. It's where they hold the girls before the night train comes. It's isolated. Her pencil moved again, to a dark smudge on the map northeast of town. 3 Juniper Wash. There's an old, defunct ore mill there. Corbett Hale, the freighters, use the sheds to store their wagons. She looked at Cal. "It's right next to Widow's Run, where you saw the tracks." Tessa looked at the map, then at Nora. "What's the plan? We can't just ride in. They have guns. They have the law." "We won't use their law," Nora said. "We'll use their own system against them." She looked at Cal, a silent question. He was her anchor. He met her gaze and gave a single, firm nod. The plan is simple," Nora said, the word simple, tasting like a lie, but a necessary one. "And it has to be sharp. We need two things: Wythe's real ledger, and we need to stop that night train. The ledger is our proof. The train is our leverage. She laid out the pieces. To get the ledger, we have to get into Wythe's safe. We can't break it open. He'd just claim we fabricated the contents. We have to get in, take the ledger, and get out, without him knowing we were ever there. Not until it's too late. The safe is new, Cal said, his voice practical. A solid iron import from St. Louis. I saw them deliver it. Picking it isn't an option. We don't pick it, Cal said. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner. One Nora had assumed held tools or winter blankets. He lifted the lid. The scent of old leather and metal filled the air. He reached deep inside and pulled out a small, heavy object, wrapped in an oily cloth. He unwrapped it. It was a small, finely wrought piece of iron, a handle on one end, a quarter-sized, intricate design on the other. It was his maker's stamp, the Sparrow Wing brand he had shown the deputy, but in iron, designed to be heated and struck. "This is my stamp," he said. "From my farrier days. I marked my work, but I made other tools." He reached back into the chest and pulled out a small, steel die, its face perfectly flat but for a single raised dot. A farrier knows how to work metal, hot or cold. That's safe. The hinges are on the outside. They're held with heavy, countersunk rivets. Nora stared at him, understanding dawning. "You're not going to pick the lock," she breathed. "No," Cal said, weighing the small die in his palm. "I'm going to replicate the rivet marks. I'll drill out the pins. Clean. The safe door will swing open. We take what we need. Then I'll reseat the pins, and use a stamp like this to mimic the original maker's marks on the new metal. It'll look like it was never touched. But I need to get inside, and I need time." "Time," Nora said, turning back to the map. "Pike Larrabee. He rides the wash every other dusk. His next ride is tomorrow. That's our clock." She looked at Tessa. "We trap him between his own timetables. We need to create a diversion, something big enough to pull Wythe from his office, and something to keep Larrabee occupied. The night train," Cal said, "if we can stop it, or derail the schedule." "The telegraph office," Nora said, her mind igniting. "The telegrapher. Silas. Smokes at 9. His wife, she knows code." The plan was forming. Sharp and dangerous. "We need a team. We can't do this alone." "Who?" Tessa said, her voice laced with the town's ingrained suspicion. "Who in that town would help us people who have already helped?" Nora said. "People who are sick of being mops." They recruited quietly, under the cover of dusk and necessity. The first was Mrs. Dalloway. Nora met her in the alley behind the dress shop, ostensibly to return a borrowed needle. The small woman was trembling, but her eyes were firm. "Ilara," Nora said, "I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to use your keys. Mrs. Dalloway, it turned out, did more than take scraps from the printer. She was hired by the town to clean the courthouse, a fact she kept quiet. Magistrate Wythe is particular," she whispered, her hand tightening on her broom. "He keeps the back hall locked, but he gave me a key." "For the cleaning closet. Does that closet?" Nora asked. "Share a wall with his office, Mrs.?" Dalloway's eyes widened. "Yes, a thin one." "Good," Cal said, stepping from the shadow. He terrified the small woman, but his voice was gentle. "All we need, ma'am, is for that closet door to be unlocked tomorrow, at 9 o'clock, and for you to be nowhere near it." The second was Sarah Silas, the telegrapher's wife. She was a stern, rail-thin woman who had lost her own cousin to a camp cook job 2 years prior. They found her hanging laundry in the twilight. "My Silas is a good man," she told them, her hands methodically pinning a sheet to the line. "But he's a company man. He won't break the rules. We're not asking him to," Nora said. "We're asking you. You know the code. You sit with him while he works. He smokes at 9, Sarah said, her voice flat. "For 10 minutes, regular as a clock. The office is empty." "We need a message sent," Cal said. "A false delay. Bridge inspection at Redwater Ford. Hold spur train." Something to break Larrabee's schedule. Something to make him ride out to the spur to see what's wrong. Sarah Silas stopped pinning. She looked at Nora, woman to woman. "You'll stop him for good. We'll break him," Nora promised. Sarah nodded once. 9 o'clock, the last and most dangerous recruit was Deputy Miller. They found him drinking, alone, at the Miner's Rest, long after the gambler had gone to bed. He was staring into a glass of amber whiskey, the picture of a man who hated himself. Cal slid onto the stool next to him. Nora stood behind him, a shadow in the doorway. "Miller," Cal said. The deputy started, sloshing his drink. "Ransom, ma'am, what do you want?" "We know you're sick of being Wythe's mop," Nora said, her voice clear and cold, cutting through the whiskey fumes. Miller's face crumpled, then hardened. "You don't know anything. We know Wythe is signing fraudulent contracts and shipping girls like freight," Cal said, his voice a flat line. "We know Larrabee is his dog, and we know you're the man who has to clean up the mess, the man who has to look the mothers in the eye." Miller winced, closing his eyes. "Get out. Tomorrow night," Nora said. "We are going into Wythe's office. We are taking his ledger. We are stopping Larrabee. All we need from you is for you to be somewhere else. Go check on a brawl at the far end of town. Go inspect the jail cells. For 10 minutes, that's all. You're asking me to turn my back," he whispered. "To break my oath." What oath? Nora's voice was sharp, a teacher's correcting tone. "The one where you protect citizens, or the one where you hold the coats for men like Wythe and Larrabee? Choose one." Cal laid a single, heavy silver dollar on the bar. Not as a bribe, as a reminder. The dollar he had paid for Nora's bond. "You've got a choice to make. Deputy, be his mop, or be a lawman." Cal and Nora turned and walked out, leaving the dollar and the deputy to his conscience. They met Tessa back at the edge of town, where she'd been holding the horses. "It's set," Nora said, "but we need a distraction." At the depot, someone to keep Larrabee's men busy while Sarah sends the message and Cal gets into the courthouse. "I'll do it," Tessa said. Nora looked at her. The girl was vibrating, but not with fear, with pure, undiluted rage. "No, Tessa, it's too dangerous. You're the one who took the ledger. If they see you, that's why I have to," she insisted. Her face was pale in the starlight, but her eyes were burning. "My sister, Ruth. She's at Bishop's Spur. I know it. They're holding her for that train. You need to keep Pike busy. I can do that. I can smile. I can ask him when the next train is coming. I can smile like nothing's wrong. I can smile right up until the moment you tear it all down." Her resolve was absolute. It was a moral clarity that matched Nora's own. To argue would be to insult her. "All right," Nora said. "Your point. But the second the message is sent, you ride straight here, to Mrs. Dalloway's. You don't look back." "I won't look back," Tessa agreed. They rode back to Sparrow Ridge. The plan settled, heavy as a stone. In the air between them, the heist was on. As Cal prepared his tools, oiling the drill bit, checking his stamps in the moonlight, Nora went to her room. She packed a small satchel, her ledger, the scrap of paper from the printer, the forged receipt book. She paused, then went to the porch. Cal's canteen, the one he had given her, was hanging on its peg. She took it. She went to the table, where the sprig of larkspur she had saved was now dry, but still vividly blue. She carefully tucked the flower into her saddlebag. Beside the canteen, luck was not a random thing. It was not a gift from the heavens. Luck, she thought, was what you made with your own hands. It was the plan you built, the allies you trusted. It was the proof you gathered. Luck was what you made, and what you chose to carry with you. She was ready. Dusk settled on Coyote Bend not as a gentle blanket, but as a slow, gritty closing of an eye. The heat of the day reluctantly released its grip on the dust, and the air filled with the sounds of a town ending its labor. The depot was the town's humming, iron heart, exhaling a plume of steam from a waiting freight engine and buzzing with the low murmur of men finishing their shifts. The light turned a soft, bruised purple, blurring the hard edges of the buildings and lengthening the shadows until they stretched like grasping fingers across the main street. It was an hour of transitions, an hour of lowered guards, Inside the courthouse, a clerk named Finch, a man whose ambition had long since soured into routine, was closing up. He whistled a tuneless, melancholy song as he swept the floor, the bristles of his broom whispering across the dusty planks. He checked the windows, locked the front door, and then, with a long, weary sigh, he turned to the magistrate's office. He opened the heavy iron safe, placed the day's meager cash box inside, and then, 10 minutes earlier than the regulations demanded, he swung the heavy door shut. He spun the dial, the tumblers clicking into place with a sound of heavy finality. Locking up early was the bad habit of an honest man, a man eager to get home to his supper, a man who believed the town's evils kept the same business hours he did. He did not check the back door to the alley. He never did. The clock on the depot tower began to strike the hour. 8 o'clock. The plan was in motion. From the shadows of the alleyway behind the courthouse, 2 figures detached themselves from the darkness. Cal moved with a liquid silence, carrying a small, heavy leather roll. Nora was a step behind him, her face pale but set in the dim light. They reached the back door. It was unlocked. As Mrs. Dalloway had promised, at the same moment, at the front of the courthouse, Mrs. Dalloway herself created the first diversion. She scurried up the steps, her face a mask of theatrical panic, and rattled the locked door. Mr. Finch, Mr. Finch, thank heavens you're still here. The clerk, halfway down the street, turned with an annoyed sigh. We're closed. Mrs. Dalloway. But it's an emergency, she cried, her voice carrying the high-pitched quaver of genuine distress. She held up a half-finished dress of fine calico. It's for the mayor's wife for the rail spur celebration, and I've ripped the seam. A terrible, terrible rip. I must have a specific thread, the one the magistrate ordered from St. Louis. I'll only be a moment. It was a perfect performance. Finch, trapped between the annoyance of returning and the fear of offending the mayor's wife, cursed under his breath and fumbled for his keys. The jangle of them covered the faint, oiled click of the alley door swinging inward. Inside, the courthouse smelled of stale paper, ink, and dust. Cal and Nora slipped down the hall, their soft-soled boots making no sound. The door to the cleaning closet stood ajar. They slipped inside, into the cramped darkness that smelled of lye soap and damp rags, and pulled the door shut behind them. Cal knelt, unrolling his leather toolkit on the floor. The second piece of the clockwork was Tessa. She walked into the depot waiting room, her stride confident. The fear banked deep behind her eyes. Pike Larrabee was there, as they knew he would be, overseeing the loading of a private freight car. He stood by the baggage scale, a cigar clenched in his teeth, his bulk radiating a smug, proprietary authority. Tessa approached him, a hesitant smile on her face. Mr. Larrabee. He turned, his eyes narrowing, then widening in recognition. The girl from the Miner's Rest, the one who worked at the hotel. He took the cigar from his mouth and smiled. A predator's smile. Well now. Lost little lady no, sir, she said, her voice pitched to sound both respectful and a little flirtatious. I was just wondering. My sister, Ruth, she took one of those cook positions you were offering. At Larkspur Spur. I was hoping you might know when she might be sending her first wages home. Pike laughed, a low, rumbling sound. He was winning a game only he believed he was playing. He looked her over, his gaze lingering. Your sister is a hard worker. The company takes good care of its people. Wages come at the end of the month, regular as rain. He leaned against the scale. You looking for work yourself? We always have openings for a pretty girl who knows how to smile. Tessa laughed, a light, airy sound that cost her everything. Oh, I don't know, sir. I'm not as strong as Ruth. She kept him talking, asking him about the railroad, about the new spur. Her performance of flawless, shimmering lie. Pike, his ego stroked, his authority affirmed, was utterly captivated. He saw a conquest, a simple, pretty thing to be charmed. He did not see the rage burning in her eyes, the steel in her spine. The clock struck 9. in the cleaning closet. Cal pressed his ear to the wall, listening to the silence of Wythe's office. He took a fine, hardened steel drill bit from his roll, fitted it into a small hand-cranked drill, and wrapped the handle in oiled cloth to muffle the sound. He began to work on the top hinge pin of the safe, his movements precise, his breath held. Prayer was for churches. This was work for a farrier's hands. In the telegraph office, Silas, the telegrapher, stood up and stretched. "Be back in 10, he said to his wife, Sarah, who sat mending in the corner. He walked out onto the porch for his nightly smoke. The moment the door closed, Sarah was in his chair. Her hands, which had been mending a sock, moved to the telegraph key with an entirely different kind of purpose. At that exact second, outside the telegraph office, Deputy Miller, who had been leaning against a post, pushed himself upright. He saw two of Larrabee's men watching Tessa with leering interest. Miller walked toward them, putting himself in their line of sight. He took a deep breath and coughed. It was a loud, rattling, explosive cough, a paroxysm of noise that made both men turn. Evening. "Deputy," one of them said. "Dust," Miller rasped, pounding his chest. "Gets in a man's lungs." He kept coughing, a strategic, distracting barrage of noise that covered the frantic, sharp clicking coming from inside the telegraph office. Sarah's fingers danced. "Bridge inspection at Redwater Ford. Track unstable. Hold spur train until dawn. Urgent." She repeated the message twice, then wiped the key clean and was back in her chair, sock in hand. A half-second before Silas walked back in the closet. The first hinge pin came free, silent as a sigh. Cal set it carefully on the cloth. Nora stood guard at the door, her hand resting on the cool iron of the latch, her body a rigid line of tension. Her own hand, she noted with a distant sort of pride, did not shake. Years of holding a stick of chalk, of drawing steady, unwavering lines on a slate before a class of restless children, had taught her a stillness that was now her greatest weapon. The second pin came free. Cal put his shoulder to the safe door and pushed. It swung open with a low, deep groan, the sound of a giant waking up. The inside of the safe was not filled with gold. It was filled with the town's soul, land deeds, rail bonds, and, on the top shelf, a single, heavy ledger bound in dark green leather. Cal lifted it out. It was heavier than it should have been. He handed it to Nora. She opened it on the floor. In the sliver of light coming from the hall, it was all there, a meticulous record of human trafficking, written in Simeon Wythe's elegant, flourishing hand. Names, advances, fees. She saw Elspeth Reed's name, and next to it, a signature that was a cruel parody of the girl's own. She saw Ruth Marrow's name, page after page, a litany of stolen lives. And in a leather pouch tucked beside the ledger, she found a stack of pink paper slips, scrip, company money, printed for the lodging at the remote camps. It was worthless anywhere else. Another link in the chain, ensuring the girls could never save enough real money to escape. Suddenly, a sound from the street. Heavy footsteps on the boardwalk. The unmistakable jingle of spurs. Pike Larrabee. Nora's blood went cold. Cal moved instantly. A shadow in the shadows. He pushed her back, deep into the corner of the closet, pressing her behind the hanging mops and brooms. He stood in front of her, his body a solid wall, his hand gripping the handle of the heavy drill. The back door to the courthouse opened. Pike cursed, his voice echoing in the hall. "Finch damned clerk locked up before I could get my cigars." Wythe keeps a box in his desk. His footsteps came down the hall, loud and confident. He stopped right outside their closet door. Nora held her breath, convinced he could hear the wild, frantic drumming of her own heart. She pressed her face into the rough wool of Cal's shirt, smelling the clean scent of him mixed with the acrid odor of her own fear. A pen, dislodged from Cal's leather roll, chose that moment to fall. It hit the wooden floor with a tiny, sharp tick. The sound was a cannon shot in the silence. Pike's footsteps stopped. The jingle of his spurs went silent. He was listening. Nora could feel his presence through the thin wood of the door, a physical pressure of malice and suspicion. What the hell? His voice rumbled. He pushed the door to Wythe's office. It swung open, revealing the empty room, the moonlight striping the floor. Then, his shadow fell across the crack of light under their own door. He was right there. A floorboard creaked as he bent down. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. This was the end of the plan. He was looking for the source of the sound. His gaze, she imagined, was sweeping the dusty floor of the hallway. He would see the pen. He would see the faint scratches around the closet door. He grunted. Damn rats. His shadow moved away. He entered Wythe's office. They heard a drawer slide open, then slam shut. His footsteps retreated down the hall. The back door opened, then closed with a solid thud. The jingle of his spurs faded into the night. They waited, motionless. For a full minute, Nora was trembling. A violent, uncontrollable shiver. Cal's hand found hers in the darkness, his grip strong and steady, pulling her back from the edge of panic. Now, he whispered. They moved with a new, desperate urgency. Nora took the ledger. She couldn't take the whole thing. It was too bulky. She carefully, with surgical precision, sliced out the pages that mattered most: the contracts, the tally sheets of fees, the damning evidence. She folded them into a tight, flat packet and slipped them deep into the hidden pocket of her bodice lining. The papers a cold, sharp proof against her skin. Cal worked on the safe. He slid the door back into place. He inserted the hinge pins, his movements swift and sure. He used a small hammer and a block of wood to drive them home, the sound a series of soft, muffled thuds. Then he took out his small, custom-made die. He placed it over the end of the new pin and gave it a single, sharp tap with the hammer. He repeated the process on the second pin. Nora looked. The rivet marks were perfect, indistinguishable from the others. The safe looked as if it had never been touched. They slipped out of the closet, down the hall, and into the cool, dark alley. They didn't run, they walked. Two ordinary shadows melting into the night. As they reached the edge of town, the first drops of rain began to fall. Nora looked up. The sky was not clear. To the west, huge, dark thunderheads were stacking up against the mountains, their bellies glowing with flashes of silent, internal lightning. Another storm was coming. She put her hand to her chest, feeling the sharp, rectangular edges of the stolen pages. Outside, a storm of wind and water was gathering, but inside, in the heart of their small conspiracy, a new storm, a storm of ink and proof, was about to break. By dawn, Pike Larrabee knew. The telegraph from Redwater Fort had come an hour ago. A furious, confused query from the station master about a non-existent bridge inspection. There was no unstable track. The spur train had been held for nothing. The trick was a blade, and it slid into Pike's gut with a cold twist. It wasn't just the delay. It was the public nature of it. The telegraph. It meant the operator was in on it. It meant the entire town was laughing at him. His rage was a physical, choking thing. It wasn't Wythe. Wythe was too smart to be this bold and too cowardly to be this direct. It was the schoolmarm, the one who had slipped the bond, the one who had walked away with ransom, the one who looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only calculation. He rode his horse half to death, not to town, but to the old ore mill at Juniper Wash. The collection of sheds and shacks, hidden by the canyon walls, was the true headquarters for his operation. He skidded to a halt, his face a mask of purple-red fury. Find the schoolmarm. He roared at the half-dozen men lounging by a breakfast fire. Sweep the town. Check the ranch. I want her, and I want ransom. Find them. Now. Nora, however, was not at the ranch. She was riding the dun mare, Jenny, keeping to the low arroyos, her path taking her toward the edge of town. The plan had been to meet Tessa at Mrs. Dalloway's shop, to coordinate the release of the ledger's information, to prepare for the fallout. She felt the papers against her skin, a cold, rectangular promise. She was armed with truth, and she felt, for the first time, a sharp, clear spike of hope. The hope died at Larkspur Spur. She was cutting across the open ground, a mile from the town limits. when two riders crested a low hill. They weren't lawmen. They were Pike's men, their faces hard, their eyes landing on her with a shock of predatory recognition. "Well, looky here," one of them said. Nora wheeled the mare, kicking her hard, but Jenny was a ranch horse, not a racer. They were on her in seconds. One man grabbed the bridle, the mare rearing in panic. The other, a burly man with a rope scar on his neck, leaned from his saddle and grabbed Nora by the arm. He hauled her bodily from the mare. Her cry cut short as she hit the ground. The air knocked from her lungs. She felt her canteen, the one Cal had given her, rip free from her belt. "Pike wants you. Schoolmarm," the man said, breathing hard. He looped a rope around her wrists. Rough and tight. They didn't bother with her horse. They just threw her, face down, across the saddle of the first rider and rode hard for Juniper Wash. She was hauled, like a sack of grain, to the ore mill shack. The world a jarring upside-down blur of dust and pain. Cal returned to Sparrow Ridge as the sun climbed high. He had ridden a wide circle, hiding his tools deep in a rock crevice in Widow's Run, covering his tracks, ensuring no one could connect him to the courthouse break-in. The ranch was too quiet. The silence hit him first. He walked into the kitchen. The ledgers, the maps, all the evidence they had collected were safe, tucked beneath a loose floorboard just as they had planned. But Nora was gone. The dun mare was not in the corral. Her saddle was missing. That was part of the plan. She was to ride to town, but on the kitchen table, where they had shared their first quiet, new morning coffee, sat 2 cups. His was empty. Hers was half full. He put his hand to the side of the cup. It was still warm. She hadn't just left. She had been taken. The rage that rose in him was not the hot, explosive fury of Pike Larrabee. It was a cold, white, compressed fire, a forge heat that burned away all distraction. It turned his fear to focus. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, where she was, Larrabee, exposed, would have retreated to his den, Juniper Wash. He did not ride for the marshal. He rode for his posse. He found Ruth Marrow, Tessa's cousin, loading freight at the depot. She was a teamster, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with arms like cured oak and her sister's same burning eyes. Cal didn't waste words. "Pike has Nora. He has your sister, Juniper Wash." Ruth didn't speak. She just slammed the freight door, locked it, and went to her wagon team. He found Mrs. Dalloway in her shop, her hands trembling as she swept the floor. "They have her. Ilara. Pike took her." The old woman's terror vanished, replaced by a cold, avian fury. That animal. She went to the hat display in her window, took a hat and pulled a pin from it. It was not a small, delicate thing. It was a 10-inch steel pin with a jet black head, a tool that could fell an ox or a man. She slid it into the sleeve of her dress. "I'm coming. She may need tending." He found Deputy Miller standing by the jail yard, staring at the gallows, his shotgun cradled in his arms. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, a man who had wrestled with his own soul and lost. "Ransom," he said, his voice a dry croak. "Pike Larrabee has Nora Lysander," Cal said, his voice flat. "He's holding her at the ore mill. He's running a slave ring out of your town. I'm going to get her." "Are you a lawman, or are you just Wythe's Mop Miller's hands?" Which had been trembling, went still on the shotgun. He had never fired it at a man. Not yet. He looked at Cal, and his broken pride finally found a purchase. He checked the breech, the shuck-shuck of the pump action, a solid, definitive sound in the morning air. He followed Cal to his horse. They met Ruth's wagon, and a frantic, dust-covered Tessa at the edge of town. "I saw them," Tessa cried, pointing northeast. "2 of his men. They took her. They were riding for the Wash." This was their posse, a teamster, a seamstress, a frightened girl, and a deputy with a gun he didn't know how to use. And Cal knew the land. Henderson Cut was the only way in and out of the Wash, a narrow slot canyon with sheer, black basalt walls. It was a natural trap. The acoustics were a nightmare. A shout would echo for seconds. A boot scrape would sound like a landslide. "Ruth," Cal said, his voice the quiet, sharp command of a general. "You keep your wagon here, behind this rise. When you hear my shot, you block the cut, wall to wall. Nothing gets out. Miller." He pointed to a cluster of rust-red boulders 100 yards from the main shack. "Your shotgun is for close work. Get there. Stay down. Don't fire until they're on top of you. And don't miss misses. Dalloway, Tessa, you stay with the horses. If we're not back in an hour, you ride for the U.S. Marshal in Redwater. You tell him everything." Then Cal, with his Winchester, began to climb. He moved like a lizard, up the sheer basalt teeth of the canyon's north rim, until he was perched high above, a vengeful god with a clear view of the entire compound. Inside the ore mill shack, the air was hot and smelled of sweat, rust, and fear. Nora was tied to a chair, the ropes biting into her wrists. Pike Larrabee paced in front of her, his face swollen with rage. "You thought you were smart," he snarled, backhanding her. The blow snapped her head to the side, and the coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. "A bridge inspection. You and that rancher, you think you can stop me," Nora's mind, through the pain, was icy clear. "Stall. Keep him talking." Her hands, tied behind the chair, were already working, feeling the wood. She felt a sharp, protruding nail head. She began to saw the hemp rope against it. A tiny, repetitive, desperate motion. "You can't stop this," she spat, her voice surprisingly steady. "You're just the animal. Withe is the brain. What's he get for each girl?" Pike, $1.10 Pike, always the mouth, always the brute who needed to prove he was the one in charge, laughed. His arrogance was his weakness. "Withe," he sneered. "He gets his $10 a head from the railroad, and he pockets the security bond. But the script, the pink paper that keeps them working, that's all mine. They're my girls, my property. I built this schoolmarm, men like me." He was bragging. He was giving her the confession she'd been unable to get. She filed it away, through the pain, through the fear. Names, figures, percentages. It was an arithmetic lesson. $10 for Wythe, the script for Pike. She kept sawing the rope. High above, Cal saw Tessa's signal. The girl had crept to the south rim. A flash of a small mirror. Once, twice. Pike is in the main shack. She's with him. Cal settled the Winchester against his shoulder. He found his breath. He exhaled. And on the quiet moment between heartbeats, he moved. His first shot was not at the shack. It was at the guard on the porch of the bunkhouse. The crack of the rifle was a physical explosion, slamming against the canyon walls, echoing like a cannonade. The guard spun, a red flower blooming on his chest, and collapsed. Chaos. Men poured from the bunkhouse, guns drawn, firing wildly at the cliffs. Pike reacted, but not with a gun. He grabbed Nora, kicking the chair over. Her ropes weakened, snapped. He hauled her to her feet, a long knife appearing in his hand. He put the blade to her throat and dragged her out the door into the dusty, bullet-laced yard. "Ransom!" he bellowed, his voice a distorted echo from the canyon walls. "I know you're up there. You fire again. She's dead. You hear me? Drop your guns or I'll cut my property." He began to drag her backward, using her as a shield, heading for the slag pile. Nora, her hands free, her mind a sliver of ice, did not struggle. She let him drag her. She waited. He was focused on the cliffs, his eyes squinting against the sun. His instep, encased in a heavy boot, was exposed for a single, perfect second. She drove her heel down, all her weight, all her rage. Pike howled, a strangled, animal sound. His grip on her loosened, his arm reflexively pulling back, the knife lifting from her throat for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She dropped, twisting, elbowing him hard in the ribs, and rolled away from him into the dust. Cal was waiting. The moment she dropped, his target was clear. His second shot was not a killing shot. It was a farrier's shot. It was precise. It struck Pike's right hand, the one holding the knife. The sound of a bullet hitting bone was sharp and wet. The knife clattered to the ground. Pike screamed, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. He scrambled, his only thought escape. He ran for the canyon mouth, for Henderson Cut. He rounded the corner and skidded to a halt. Ruth Marrow's heavy freight wagon, the mules at a full gallop, exploded from behind the rise, sliding to a halt and blocking the cut, wall to wall, a fortress of wood and iron. Pike turned, trapped, his eyes wild, and he saw Deputy Miller. The deputy stepped out from behind the boulders, 20 yards away. He was pale, sweating, and his hands were shaking so badly the barrel of his shotgun wobbled. Pike saw the fear. He saw the hesitation. He snarled and lunged, a wounded animal charging, betting the lawman wouldn't have the stomach for it. Deputy Miller looked at the man who had made him a coward. He saw Nora, climbing to her feet, covered in dust. He saw the ghosts of Elspeth and Ruth and all the others. His hand stopped shaking. He fired. He fired. And for the first time in his career, he fired his weapon for exactly the right reason. The blast, at that range, was devastating. Pike Larrabee was thrown backward, his charge ending in a crumpled, final heap. The echoes of the shot rattled down the canyon. And then, there was silence. The Coyote Bend courthouse was a pressure cooker. The air, thick with the unwashed scent of sweat, dust, and nervous anticipation, was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the shoulders. Every bench was packed tight, men in dusty work clothes pressed against women in their faded Sunday best. They stood in the aisles, filled the doorway, and craned their necks from the open windows, their faces a sea of pale, grim curiosity. The heat was a living thing, amplifying the low hum of whispers, the shuffle of boots, the dry coughs that punctuated the tense silence. It was the largest crowd the courthouse had ever held, a town that had come not for a trial, but for a reckoning. At the center of it all, on the raised judge's bench, sat Simeon Wythe. He was an island of powdered calm in the roiling sea of the crowd. His suit was dark, impeccably brushed. His hair was perfectly parted. His hands, resting on the polished wood of the bench, were ink clean, the nails buffed. He presided over the chaos with an air of bored, unassailable authority, his face a mask of judicial indifference. He was not a judge, he was a king on a throne of his own making, and this was merely a peasant uprising to be quashed. To his right sat a subdued Pike Larrabee, his arm in a sling, a scowl of pure hatred on his face. He was an animal in a cage, waiting for his master to unleash him. The proceedings had been a farce from the start. Wythe had convened this public hearing himself, a power play designed to reassert his control. He had declared the events at Juniper Wash the work of vigilantes, of public disturbers, and had brought Nora Lysander and Cal Ransom before him on charges of inciting a riot and interfering with railroad business. "This is not a trial," Wythe had announced, his voice smooth and oiled. "This is a hearing to establish the facts before the circuit judge arrives. The facts, as presented, are simple. These two." He gestured dismissively toward Nora and Cal, who stood before the bench. "Took the law into their own hands. We are here to present a different set of facts, Your Honor," Nora said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the packed room. Wythe's lips thinned into a semblance of a smile. "By all means. Miss Lysander, present your speculation." Cal stepped forward. He carried the heavy, green leather ledger. He did not slam it down. He placed it on the wooden rail of the witness stand with a quiet, solid thud that was more powerful than any shout. The sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd, drawing every eye. Nora stepped up beside it. She was not the soot-smudged woman from the jail yard, nor the terrified captive from the ore mill. She stood tall, her dress clean, her hair pinned back. She was a schoolmistress again, and this was her classroom. She opened the ledger. Her voice did not waver. It was not emotional. It was the clean, precise blade of truth. "I am here to read a list of names into the public record," she began. "The names of citizens of this territory who were defrauded of their liberty and their wages under color of law." She began to read. Elspeth Reed, 18 years of age. Contract signed May 12th, 1886. Current whereabouts unknown. A strangled sob came from the back of the room. A woman in a faded gingham dress. Mrs. read, held a handkerchief to her mouth. Sarah Gooding, 17 years of age, contract signed May 14th, last seen at Bishop's Spur. Ruth Marrow, 19 years of age. She read on, name after name, a litany of the living and the gone. With each name, the temperature in the room seemed to rise. The whispers died. The shuffling stopped. The town was holding its breath, listening to the quiet, devastating roll call of its own stolen daughters. When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. Wythe's calm was, for the first time, strained. A faint sheen of sweat had appeared on his powdered brow. A list of names proves nothing, he said, his voice a little too sharp. Disgruntled employees who have likely run off from their obligations. Then let us present the obligations. Nora said. She called her first witness, Mrs. Ilara Dalloway walked to the front, her steps small but firm. She held a tiny scrap of paper. This is a printer's seal. Mrs. Dalloway said, her voice trembling but clear. From the courthouse press, I found it while cleaning. It bears the initials S.W. It is the same seal pressed into every one of the contracts in that ledger. She placed the scrap on the rail, next to the book. It was a small, almost insignificant piece of evidence, but it was a link, a physical thread. Next came Sarah Silas, the telegrapher's wife. She was stern, unflinching. I am familiar with the codes used by the railroad, she stated. I am also familiar with the private codes used by Mr. Larrabee and Magistrate Wythe. She detailed the false delay codes, the messages about replacements, the secret language of their entire operation. Her testimony was not emotional. It was a cold, factual dissection of their conspiracy. Then came Deputy Miller. He walked to the stand not as a lawman, but as a penitent. He did not look at Wythe. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of the people he had failed. He admitted everything. The inflated bond fees, the practice of turning vagrancy charges into labor contracts, the way Wythe would sign the papers and he would enforce them. I was a coward, he said, his voice thick with shame. I was his mop. I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing. Wythe's face was a mask of cold fury. The testimony of a self-admitted derelict, duly noted. He was losing control, and he knew it. He was trying to discredit them, to paint them all as unreliable, emotional, hysterical. But then the courtroom door opened. A woman stepped through. She was not a resident of Coyote Bend. She was a hard-faced woman from the shacks at Larkspur Spur. She wore a borrowed bonnet, too small for her head, and a dress that had seen too much sun, but her spine was made of iron. She walked, unbidden, to the front of the courtroom. My name is Martha Gooding, she said, her voice rough as stone. My daughter is Sarah. She turned and pointed a work-worn finger, not at Wythe, but at Pike Larrabee. I saw that man, she said, her voice ringing with a mother's fury. I saw him at the Spur. I saw him with my Sarah. He told her she owed him for a broken dish. He said her debt was $50. I saw the way he looked at her. I saw the wagons come in the night. He loaded her onto that freight car like she was ore, like she was a piece of rock to be smelted down. Where is my daughter? The question hung in the hot, still air, an unanswerable, terrible indictment. The crowd, which had been murmuring, now began to hum, a low, dangerous sound. Wythe's composure finally cracked. He sneered, a flash of his true, arrogant self showing through the powdered calm. This is not a court of law. This is a theater of speculation and sentiment, he declared, his voice rising. A mother's grief, a dressmaker's scraps, a drunkard's confession. It means nothing. There is no proof. There is this. Nora said. She reached into the ledger. She did not take out one of the contracts. She took out the very last page. It was not a tally sheet. It was a summary page, a final accounting of profits from the script system, the system Pike had bragged about. At the bottom of the page, beneath a final tally of over $2,000, was a signature, approving the account. She walked forward. She did not place it on the rail. She handed it with a steady hand. directly to Simeon Wythe. He took it. He looked at it. He saw his own signature, his elegant, flourishing signature, the one he had practiced since he was a boy in her classroom. It slanted across the page, a perfect, damning confession. Nora had seen that slant before. It was the slant of a boy trying to hide a poorly written answer. It slanted like a guilty man's shoulder. Wythe's face went white. The powdered calm dissolved, revealing the pinched, terrified face of a man who had been caught. His ink-clean hands trembled. He looked from the page to Nora, his eyes filled with a pure, distilled hatred. He reached for his gavel. He would end this. He would clear the court. He would silence them all. His fingers closed around the handle, but before he could lift it, before he could bring it down, Cal Ransom spoke for the first time. His voice was not loud. It was as quiet and as heavy as the ledger he had placed on the rail. It was the sound of a gate bar dropping, solid and final. That's a confession that writes itself. The murmur in the courtroom became a roar. It was a wave of sound, of fury, of a town's collective rage finally unleashed. Men were on their feet, shouting. Women were crying openly. The heat, the pressure, the injustice, it all exploded. Mayor Thompson, a man whose primary political skill was sensing which way the wind was blowing, saw the hurricane coming. He looked at Wythe's white, terrified face, then at the roaring crowd. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the lawman standing by the door, the UN marshal who had been quietly observing the proceedings from the moment they began. The marshal moved. He walked through the chaos, an unstoppable force, and stepped up onto the judge's platform. Wythe stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The marshal took a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The click, as he fastened them around Wythe's ink-clean wrists, was louder than the roar of the crowd. Pike Larrabee, seeing his protector fall, began to howl. This is what progress looks like. We are building a territory. This is industry. His shouts were answered by a profound, damning silence. The crowd turned to look at him, their faces cold. His industry was over. The marshal brought his own gavel, a heavy Colt revolver butt, down on the bench. The sound cracked through the room, and the crowd slowly fell silent. "This hearing is concluded," the marshal said, his voice like rocks grinding. "By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, Simeon Wythe and Pike Larrabee are under arrest." He looked at the open door. "Judge Emery," he called out. An older, severe-looking man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen everything stepped into the courtroom. It was the judge from Redwater, the real judge, summoned by a telegraph from a U.S. marshal who had seen enough. Judge Emery took the bench. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the prisoners. He looked at the crowd. "The evidence presented in this room is overwhelming," he declared, his voice the very sound of law. "The court hereby rules that all labor contracts signed under the authority of Magistrate Wythe are null and void. All debts associated with them are ruled fraudulent and are hereby canceled. All persons held under these contracts." He looked directly at Martha Gooding and Tessa Merrow, "are free citizens of this territory. Effective immediately." A wave of relief, of cheers and tears, washed through the room. Justice, real justice, had finally come to Coyote Bend. But Nora was not finished. She stepped forward again. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority, "I ask for one more thing." Judge Emery looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his tired eyes. "What is it, Miss Lysander?" "Punishment is not enough. Erasure is the last theft. I ask for a court order requiring the clerk to read the name of every single girl from that ledger into the official town minutes. Let their names be recorded. Let it be known that they were here, that they mattered." The judge stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "So ordered." He looked at the clerk, Finch, who sat frozen at his desk. "Clerk, you have your orders." Finch, who had begun the day as Wythe's functionary, picked up his pen. His hand was shaking, but he opened a new page in the official town record book. He dipped his pen in the ink. The only sound in the now silent courtroom was the faint, determined scratch of his pen on the paper as he began to write the first name. History corrected. Hurts less than rumor. Justice in the high echoing confines of a courthouse is a clean, sharp thing. But revenge, the bitter, spiteful dregs of a defeated man's pride, is a dirty, creeping thing that comes in the dark. Night had settled over Sparrow Ridge, a deep, star-pricked blackness that should have been peaceful. The air was cool and clean after the previous day's storm, the earth still smelling of rain and new life. But a different scent began to snake its way up from the dry grass at the fence line, the sharp, acrid smell of kerosene, followed by the hungry crackle of a new fire. Night revenge bloomed to its full. Terrible flower. Pike's remaining riders, the ones who had scattered from Juniper Wash, had regrouped. Their leader was captured, their enterprise shattered, but their hatred remained, and so they had come. Not for a fight, but for a spiteful, cowardly act of erasure. They meant to burn Sparrow Ridge to the ground. Orange petals of flame began to lick at the dry grass, racing toward the barn. Cal was the first one out, moving from a dead sleep to full alertness in the space of a single heartbeat. He burst onto the porch, his Winchester in one hand, taking in the scene with a cold, swift calculation. Nora was a half-step behind him, her face a pale oval in the flickering, hellish light. The fear was a spike of ice in her gut, but the adrenaline was a fire that met the one in the yard. This was her home. They would not take it from her. "The well!" Cal shouted over the growing roar. "The buckets!" What followed was not chaos. It was a dance, a desperate, rhythmic ballet invented in that moment to save a home. Cal worked the pump handle, his muscles straining, the iron groaning in protest. Nora took the filled buckets, her body straining with the weight, and ran, her skirts flying. She threw the water on the leading edge of the fire, the hissing steam a small, temporary victory against the wall of flame. They worked side by side, a seamless, wordless unit. He pumped, she carried. He moved to a new position. She anticipated it. They passed in the smoke-filled darkness, their shoulders brushing, their breaths ragged, their movements a perfect, desperate harmony. They were no longer a rancher and a schoolmistress. They were two parts of a single, fighting will. But the fire was too fast, the wind too hungry. It reached the corner of the barn, and the old, dry wood caught with an explosive whoosh. Despair, cold and sharp, began to creep into Nora's heart. They were losing. And then, a new sound. The thunder of hooves, the rattle of a heavy wagon, and a furious, woman's cry cutting through the roar of the flames. Ruth Marrow drove her water wagon through the main gate like a comet. The big mules, their eyes wild, plunged through the smoke. Ruth stood on the driver's bench, a warrior queen on a chariot, her face grim with determination. She had filled every barrel in town after the hearing, anticipating this very thing. She pulled the wagon alongside the barn and released the spigot, a blessed flood of water cascading onto the burning wall. From the darkness, more figures emerged. Mrs. Dalloway, her face streaked with soot, ran into the yard, beating at the spreading ground sparks with her heavy wool shawl, her movements small but ferocious. And at the gate, Deputy Miller planted his feet. He was no longer the hesitant, broken man from the saloon. He was a lawman, as Pike's riders fired from the darkness, trying to drive them back. Miller raised his shotgun. He did not waver. The blast was a solid, authoritative roar. He pumped and fired again. He did not miss. The battle turned. The fire, which had been a raging beast, was now a cornered animal. They were pushing it back, bucket by bucket, shawl beat by shawl beat. It was then that the true devil staggered from the dark. Pike Larrabee, his arm in a bloody sling, a burning firebrand in his good hand, emerged from the smoke. He must have escaped in the chaos, a wounded wolf coming back for one last bite. His face, lit by the flames he had set, was a mask of insane, thwarted rage. "You think you've won," he screamed, his voice a raw, broken thing. "You can't erase us men like me. We built this territory with our bare hands. This is our land. He lunged toward the house, meaning to throw the firebrand onto the porch roof. Nora, who was near the well, turned. She saw him, and the last of her fear burned away, leaving only a core of cold, hard steel. "Then we'll rebuild it without you," she answered, her voice ringing out, clear and final. She was still holding the iron handle of the water pump. As Pike ran past, she swung it. It was not a wild, panicked swing. It was a calculated arc of leverage, the same principle she had used to free the heifer. The heavy iron handle caught Pike squarely in the chest. The impact knocked the air from his lungs in a great, whooping gasp and sent him sprawling into the dirt. Cal was there in an instant. He did not touch Pike. He kicked the firebrand, sending it spinning into a patch of wet mud. The last ember died with a final, angry hiss, like a snake being swallowed. The sound of more horses, ridden hard, filled the air. The U.S. Marshal and 3 deputies galloped into the yard, their guns drawn. They took in the scene, the smoldering barn, the scattered arsonists, the figure of Pike Larrabee gasping on the ground. They hauled Pike to his feet. He was a broken thing, his rage spent, leaving only a hollow, defeated shell. As they dragged him past the porch posts that hadn't burned, his eyes met Nora's. She did not look away. There was no pity in her gaze. There was no gloat. There was only closure. The mayor arrived, breathless, on a sweating horse. He waved a paper with a heavy wax seal. "It's official," he panted, eager to be on the right side of history. "I have the order from Judge Emery's own hand. Wythe has been formally removed from office. Pike Larrabee is bound for the federal prison at Yuma. All the spur contracts are rescinded. The names are to be posted on the courthouse door by sunrise." The fight was over. The victory was absolute. Slowly, the others began to depart. Ruth gave Nora a fierce, one-armed hug. "Mrs." Dalloway patted her hand, her own hand covered in soot. Deputy Miller just tipped his hat, the gesture carrying a profound, unspoken weight of gratitude and redemption. Soon, it was just the 2 of them, standing on the porch of the house that was still theirs. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and wet ash. Their faces were streaked with soot, like war paint. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. Cal turned to her in the quiet, the only light now coming from the soft red of the dying coals and the cool, distant blue of a desert star. He took a small, cloth-wrapped bundle from his pocket. It was not a ring box. It was something different, something heavier. He held it in his palm, and for the first time, Nora saw that his hand was trembling. "I forged this a long time ago," he said, his voice low and rough. "For a life I thought I'd lost." He unwrapped the cloth. Lying in his calloused palm was a key. It was hand-forged from dark iron, but the edges were bright, polished by the constant, nervous rub of his thumb over the years. It was not a crude, simple key. It was elegant, strong, and on the bow, the part a hand would hold. He had struck 2, true initials, N.L. Nora stared at it, her throat tight. "This is to your room," he said, his gaze meeting hers, full of a raw, hopeful vulnerability she had never seen before. "It's to the tack room, to the front gate." He took a breath. "And it's to whatever door you want me to open, or keep closed. All you have to do is speak." It was not a proposal of marriage. It was a proposal of partnership, a vow of equality, a promise of choice. She reached out, her sooty fingers tracing the initials. She lifted the key from his palm, from a pouch on her belt. She took a thin leather thong. She threaded it through the bow of the key and tied it around her neck. It came to rest just at the hollow of her throat, the iron cool against her skin, resting against her pulse like a promise. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the starlight, reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "You'll regret choosing me," she whispered again. But the words were not the flint-sharp warning she had spoken in the jail yard. They trembled now, not with defiance, but with the overwhelming weight of all that she was, all the fight and all the sorrow she would bring to his life. Cal's smile was quiet, and it was certain. It held all the tenderness of the rainy night, and all the strength of the battle they had just won. "Nora," he said, his voice full of a truth that settled every last doubt in the world. "I already regret waiting this long." She didn't need to say another word. She stepped into him, her arms going around his neck, and he wrapped his own around her, holding her tight against the backdrop of their saved home. They stood there, two survivors, lit by the soft red of coals and the cool blue of a desert star, and from the town below, faint on the night wind, they could hear the sound of cheering as the last warrant was nailed, firm and final, to the courthouse notice board. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.